today to, we are grateful to have another section of the Super Spreader Seminar Series. Today is April 6, 2023. Now, we want to acknowledge the land the OMNI Network's head office is located on York University. Now, the university recognizes that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which the university campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. And so York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. Now, a little bit information about this seminar. So the OMNI Super Spreader Seminar Series encourages highly qualified personnel. And by highly qualified personnel, we mean postdocs and mostly graduate students to present their research and then also to share their research experiences and establish connections among the various branches of the network. And so it is a platform that has been created to spread scientific knowledge and then also to chat about science. And so this seminar is to be beneficial for knowledge transfer among OMNI networks and the emerging infectious disease modeling networks and collaborating scientific community. Now, we are really privileged today to have Avneet Kaur to be the speaker for this seminar. And I will just talk briefly about who Avneet Kaur is and what she's currently doing. So Avneet is a graduate student at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, pursuing her MSc in mathematics. Her main research interests lie in mathematical modeling and scientific computing. And so her current research focuses on understanding the impact of human behavioral adaptation on the spread of diseases. She is currently working on a mathematical model that integrates theories on human behavior from sociology and psychology with infectious disease modeling. And so I would invite the speaker to go ahead with the talk today. But before she comes up, I just want to thank all of you for joining in today. And I hope you really enjoy the talk. Okay, so Avneet, you are welcome to share your screen and continue with what you have for us today. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the introduction. I'll share my screen quickly. Okay. Can you see the presentation in full screen?
Yes, I can see that, sure.
Okay. So, hi everyone. As introduced, I'm Avneet Kaur, a student of MSc Mathematics at UBC Okanagan, working on a project in behavioral epidemiology with Dr. Rebecca Tyson and Dr. Ian Moyles. The aim of our project is to incorporate aspects of human behavior like fair learning and unlearning in ODE models for infectious diseases, and to have a better understanding of how behavior mechanisms alter the course of an epidemic. From COVID-19 pandemic, we know it caused unprecedented impacts across all facets, and it demonstrated that human behavior plays a central role in the transmission of infectious diseases. Alongside the disease dynamics, societal emotions, behaviors, and public health policies, all of these changed, and these led to a complex feedback loop. The disease transmission influenced people's behavior by creating perceptions of the risk of disease, and people trying to avoid those risks by changing their behaviors. And people behaviors in turn shape the disease transmission, like by adoption of prophylactic actions through choosing to vaccinate, social distancing, wearing face masks, etc., which helped in controlling the disease. Now, epidemiological models allow for policymakers to understand disease dynamics better, which can then guide them in making disease decisions relevant to allocation of health resources and interventions to reduce disease spread. While the existing epidemiological models incorporate information about how infection is transmitted and the effects of interventions like vaccines, the need is to capture how individuals make behavior decisions during an epidemic. And this would affect the accuracy of these models and understanding of the realistic disease dynamics, and hence the effectiveness of policies deployed to combat the disease. So to address this limitation, my project integrates neuroscientific theories of human behavior adaptation, fair learning, fair transmission, and fair loss with the traditional ODE models of infectious diseases. This is the model that I'm working on right now, and it is an extension to the model by Epstein and authors who published the triple contagion model in the paper Triple Contagion, a Two Fears Epidemic Model. We'll build up this model from scratch, but for now, an overview of this model. All the grays represent susceptible individuals with different behavior traits. So we account for fear of vaccine through SFV, fear of disease through SFD, and simultaneous fear of disease and vaccine through SFTV. The S compartment here is for individuals who are not fearful at all. The red compartment here represents the infectious pool, who can contribute to both fear and disease spread. And lastly, in green, we have the immunized individuals. In the center, RNAT is for individuals who got sick and then gained immunity through recovery. And on the right, these greens represent immunization through vaccine. So this big model has the fundamental SIR model at its core. The susceptibles get infected at a rate beta, retaining the infection for an average period of 1/gamma days. Once the infectious period ends, people recover and gain permanent immunity to the pathogen, going to the compartment RNAT. The temporal plots here show that starting with the majority of the population in the susceptible group, as the infection spreads, the proportion of the population in the S compartment decreases and the I compartment increases, shown by this blue curve. And then the infection starts to decrease as there are insufficient susceptibles to carry out the disease. And the ones who are already infected start to recover from the disease, and we can see this red curve corresponding to recovered individuals increases. Now, let us modify this model to get one step closer to the model I showed to you in the beginning. So we add the compartment SFD for individuals who are susceptible to the disease, but also fearful of the disease. So these scared individuals would withdraw from the circulation, take prophylactic actions because they're scared, and reduce the contractibility of the disease by this factor P, which is the relative reduction in the rate of disease transmission. Now, there are two coupled contagion processes that are happening here. One of the disease and other of the fear of the disease. Individuals contract disease through contact with the disease infected, the sick people. And the second contagion is where individuals learn or lose fear. Coming to the fear contagion, the fear is assumed to be contagious in this model. The fear acquisition theory, which gives a psychological explanation for how people develop fears and phobias, suggests that fear can be learned through different mechanisms, and vicarious learning is one of those. Vicarious learning, also known as social learning, it occurs when an individual learns a new behavior or develops a new emotional response by observing the behavior or emotional response of others to a particular stimulus. And the first mechanism to develop the fear of disease here is based on the concept of vicarious learning by imitation. It occurs when an individual observes the behavior of others and then imitates that behavior without actually being exposed to the stimulus. So a regular susceptible NS observes or interacts with a fearful individual NSFD, hence acquiring fear of disease through imitation at a rate beta FD. The second mechanism of fear acquisition is vicarious learning by observation, in which an individual develops a fear response to a stimulus through observing the negative outcomes or aversive experiences of others, such as observing someone experiencing pain or harm from a particular stimulus. Taking, for an example, if you were to observe a snake attacking someone and subsequently developing a fear of snakes, this would be an example of vicarious learning by observation. So you are yourself not experiencing the negative outcomes, but you're observing someone experiencing negative effects, hence learning to fear through observation. So in this case, a regular susceptible individual observes the negative outcomes of getting infected, hence developing fear through observation at a rate beta FD. That was about fear acquisition, but fear is not permanent, and it decays in the absence of an aversive stimulus or in the presence of a positive stimulus. So in this model, fear can decay in two ways. Spontaneous fear decay is one of them, a spontaneous loss of fear, where an individual's fear response to a specific stimulus decreases without any deliberate intervention or exposure to the stimulus. This can happen naturally over time as an individual is repeatedly exposed to the stimulus. And the spontaneous fear decay can further happen due to the following sub-mechanisms. The first one is stimulus deprivation, which is a process of weakening or elimination of a previously learned association between a stimulus and a response when an individual is deprived of exposure to a specific stimulus for an extended period of time. So, for example, if someone has a fear of dogs, but has not been around any dogs for many years, they may experience a reduction in their fear response simply due to the lack of exposure to the feared stimulus. The second sub-mechanism is extinction learning, which is a process of fear loss where an individual gets exposure to the feared stimulus without experiencing negative consequences. So over time, their fear response may begin to decrease in intensity or disappear altogether. The parameter gamma F here represents the spontaneous loss of fear of disease. The second mechanism of fear decay is complacency contagion. Again, there are two possible ways of complacency leading to fear decay. First is counter conditioning, in which is a process of replacing a response with a more positive response. So we are pairing a fear-provoking stimulus with a pleasant one so that the person may come to associate the fear-provoking stimulus with the positive stimulus. And the second basis of complacency from psychology is cognitive restructuring. If an individual's fear decreases after observing that a feared stimulus is not really harmful or that its harmful effects go away with time, this can be considered an example of fear reduction through cognitive restructuring. Example of complacency leading to fear decay is someone who had developed a fear of dogs after being beaten could be exposed to playful, gentle dogs as a way to relearn that most are safe. In the disease context, when a disease-fearful individual interacts with an individual who has gained immunity by naturally recovering from the disease, that individual becomes less afraid of the disease. And alpha F here is the effective contact rate for fear loss. Okay, let us look at the results to get from this model. These plots show the fraction of population in each of the compartments with time. The blue curve here corresponds to the susceptibles with no fear of disease. And we start with majority of the population being fearless. But as the disease takes off, shown by this red curve, corresponding to the proportion of the population in infectious compartment, the fearless susceptibles acquire fear of disease, shown by the rising purple curve. The people who are fearful of the disease self-isolate and take precautions, which decreases their susceptibility to the disease through the parameter P, hence suppressing the disease. So we get this valley in the red curve. Now, because the disease level is low, fear of disease decays. So decrease in purple curve. And as a result, people come out of isolation, but the disease pathogen is still circulating, even though in a small fraction of the population. And this refuels the disease, and we get a second wave shown by this red curve. The recovered group increases as infectious individuals recover from the disease. It plateaus as the disease decreases, then again increases and plateaus as the disease goes through a second wave. One thing to notice here is that fear contagion outnumbers the disease spread, as can be seen from the scales of infection curve, which is of the order 10 to -3, versus the scale of fear disease, which is of the order 10 to the -1. And this happens because, unlike disease transmission, fear contagion does not require direct physical contact. It can happen through media. Overall, we saw how incorporating a simple behavioral adaptation mechanism can explain multiple epidemic waves that we saw during a lot of pandemics that have happened in the history. Now, we were interested in investigating how the disease dynamics changes as the fear-related parameters change. Qualitative analysis has been done by the authors Epstein and others who proposed this model, but we wanted to investigate it further mathematically. The plots on the right show the proportion of population in each of the compartments with time, and the plot on the left shows the final size of the epidemic for different values of P, which was the fear-induced contact reduction, which leads to scaling down of the susceptibility of fearful individuals to the disease. So P equals 0 corresponds to the case when people self-isolate, such that the chances of contracting the disease is 0. And we can see from this blue curve, might not be visible perfectly, but the first curve, and we can see that the fear of disease can be very effective in suppressing the disease, since we get just one small wave. And also from the final size estimate, we can see when people isolate perfectly, the final size is very small. As P increases, the likelihood of fearful individuals contracting the disease increases, and this shows up in the increasing peak size of the waves. We can see that the curves for different values of P overlap until the first peak. And this is because the fear mechanisms come into play when there are sufficient sick, scared, and recovered individuals. As P increases, the rate of disease transmission increases for the disease-fearful individuals. So larger fraction of the population would get infected, which would further drive individuals to the fear compartment, leading to more infected and so on. And this results in a higher second peak that occurs sooner. So this is, if we go from right to left, this is the direction of increasing value of P. Hence, we can infer that contagious fear mechanisms control the size and time of onset of the second wave, which can actually be bigger or smaller than the first wave. Now, let us look at the plot of the final size versus P closely. With increase in P, the final size of the epidemic increases gradually until a threshold. Beyond this point, a sudden jump is observed in the final size. Why is that? So we investigated it, looking at the time series plots, specifically for the SFD and RNet compartments. It can be clearly seen and mathematically shown that there exist two steady states for this system. For low values of P, the system ends up with a non-zero proportion of the population in the fear compartment. And for larger values of P, the system ends up with no one in the fear compartment. So SFT goes to 0. This is kind of intuitive that when the individuals isolate efficiently, the case of low P values, they are able to stay in the fear compartment and avoid the infectious individuals for long till the time there are no infectious individuals available to spread the disease. And that's how the system ends up with a lower final size of the epidemic. For large values of P, the SFT group is more exposed to the disease. The system creates a sink for the SFT group to accelerate towards the infectious group, hence completely emptying the fear group. and this results in a larger fund size of the epidemic. The population getting stuck in the fear compartment, we're getting a non-zero proportion here. So this, even after the virus has disappeared, this validates that population's fear response might be based on irrational fear learning, or that they have developed a generalized fear response in their persistent fear memory. All right, so let's add more compartments to this model to incorporate vaccination and fear of vaccine. Vaccine uptake plays a crucial role, as we know, in the control of a disease. If the vaccine is efficient enough and a threshold fraction of the population is vaccinated, then the disease can possibly be suppressed. But unfortunately, vaccine refusal is reported in top 10 threats to global health by the World Health Organization. It is responsible for the resurgence of several deadly vaccine-preventable diseases like measles, pertussis in the USA, and even polio in several countries. These evidences assert how important it is to consider behavioral adaptation due to vaccines and fear of vaccines to understand the trajectory of a disease. Coming back to the model, so SFV represents the individuals who are fearful of the vaccine and hence reject to get vaccinated. The compartment RVAC represents the individuals who gain immunity through vaccination, and AVAC represents immunized individuals who experienced adverse reactions from the vaccines. Similar to the fear mechanisms for the fear of disease, the first arrow here represents imitative learning of fear of vaccine. The second arrow represents learning by observation, by observing the adverse reaction of the vaccine. Gamma F represents spontaneous decay of fear of vaccine, and the last arrow represents the complacency contagion. So you choose to leave your fear of vaccine when you interact with someone who had gained immunity by getting vaccinated without any adverse reactions. Now, this model requires some level of fear of disease for an individual to be convinced to get vaccinated. So only the SFD group gets vaccinated. The rate of vaccination is assumed to be a variable. I'll discuss the equations governing the change in rate of vaccination. Sigma represents the rate of adverse reactions from the vaccine. So individuals go to AVAC, the adverse reaction compartment, at a rate sigma V, and the remaining 1 minus sigma V proportion gains permanent immunity through vaccination, going to the compartment RVAC. And lastly, the individuals who experience adverse reactions from the vaccine lose their negative thoughts about the vaccine spontaneously, as shown by this arrow with gamma F rate. Notice that there is no complacency contagion here between AVAC and RVAC, and that's because it is assumed that their first-hand experience with the vaccine makes them resistant to social influence. Coming to the equations determining the change in rate of vaccination, it is assumed that the rate of vaccination increases if fear of disease exceeds the fear of vaccine, and it decreases when fear of vaccine exceeds that of disease. This is represented by the difference of fraction of population in the two fear compartments, SFT and SFB. Eta is the fear difference scaling factor, and epsilon is the maximum rate of vaccination. So from the equation, as the rate of vaccination approaches epsilon, the maximum rate, dB/dt tends to 0. Okay, so the disease dynamics in this case, again, we start with the majority of the population in the fearless susceptible group. As the disease increases, shown by this red curve, individuals transfer to disease fearful compartment. So this results in two things. The fearful population goes into isolation and takes protective measures, hence suppressing the disease, which results in this valley in red curve. And the SFD grows such that it exceeds SFV. So this SFV is here in green, which leads to a positive dV/dt from the equations of rate of change of the rate of vaccination. And this reflects in the increasing vaccinated group in the magenta curve for RVAC and orange curve for A. As people start to get vaccinated, there will be reactions, which can be seen from the increasing A curve, and this induces fear of vaccine, shown by the green curve, corresponding to SFB. Now, because the disease has decreased, people become relaxed, going back to the fearless compartment, to the extent that SFV exceeds SFD. This again results in two things: the resurgence of the disease, because people are not protecting enough, and a decreasing rate of vaccination, because SFB now exceeds SFD, and this results in a plateauing of the vaccinated population. The black curve for RNAT increases as people naturally recover from the infection, and then becomes constant as the disease dies out. The takeaway from these plots is disease dynamics depends on the balance between fear of disease and fear of vaccine. If fear of disease exceeds fear of vaccine, people isolate and also accept vaccine. This suppresses the disease and the new cases fall, which drops SFT below SFV. Vaccine uptake and isolation reduces, and the disease comes back. And this is the mechanism that results in the multiple epidemic waves. Okay. Let's investigate the effect of including vaccines and fear of vaccine in addition to that of disease on the final size of the epidemic. It turns out that this model does not show a jump in the final size of the epidemic as P increases, as can be seen from the scatter plot, which is pretty continuous. Same for the time series plots of the compartments. I've clubbed S and SFV in the first plot because they are same. There are some behavior mechanisms going on between the two compartments, but with respect to disease, they are both the same. They have the same rate of susceptibility. So by the end of the epidemic, some fraction of the population will be left uninfected. The plots for SD and RNAT show pretty continuous decreasing and increasing behavior respectively as P increases. Why do we not see the bifurcation in file size with respect to P here? That's because with vaccination, the individuals are facilitated with additional places to hide from disease apart from the SFD compartment. And so even if P increases and the SFD group becomes more prone to getting infected, the SFV and RVAC compartments facilitate individuals with places to isolate from the disease, and hence the system is able to avoid a sudden increase in the final size as the value of P increases. And this shows that even if vaccines have an adverse effect and that individuals don't isolate perfectly from to avoid the disease, we can still avoid sudden worsening of disease. And that is, in the presence of vaccine, the disease would not increase unpredictably. Now, this model assumed that an individual can either be fearful of the disease, SFD, or of the vaccine, SFV, at a time. However, it is possible that an individual is fearful of both the disease and the vaccine, such that they do isolate themselves, hence reducing their contact rate, but they don't get vaccinated. To account for this behavior, we added the double fear compartment, SFDV. An individual can acquire the double fear stepwise by first acquiring one of the fears and then the other fear. The fear learning and the fear decay are based on the same mechanisms as learning single fear. So an individual can first learn fear of disease and then fear of vaccine through imitation or observation of individuals who have negative thoughts about the vaccine. The mechanisms moving population between S and SFV are the same we see here for movement from SFD to SFDV. Similarly, they can lose the fear of vaccines, hence going to single fear compartment, with fear of disease spontaneously or through complacency contagion. Likewise, on the left side, individuals can first acquire fear of vaccine and then fear of disease through exposure to negative experiences with the disease, and fear loss leaves individual with just the fear of vaccine. An individual may lose both the fears at once due to fatigue and go to the regular susceptible group at a rate gamma F. And it is assumed that doubly afraid individuals reduce their contacts more than individuals with just the fear of disease. And that's because doubly afraid individuals don't get vaccinated, so they're not protecting themselves against disease as well as the SFD group, and hence would put greater efforts in prophylaxis. So this PFDV, which is a scaling factor to reduce the disease susceptibility, is more here than the SFD group. So we are investigating this model both qualitatively and mathematically to get new insights about the overall behavior of the system, and then potentially improve the model structure if required based on the results. To wrap up, we looked at how the feedback loop between disease dynamics and behavior dynamics necessitates the inclusion of behavior adaptation and fear mechanisms in infectious disease models. Fear can spread much faster than disease, mainly because it does not require direct contact. So the health authorities may want to regulate spread of misinformation. The fear parameters determine the size and time of onset of subsequent waves, which validates that behavioral mechanisms have a significant effect on disease spread. Cycles of vigilance and complacency, so attitude shifts due to the trade-off between protecting from disease and letting it go and choosing to get vaccinated or not can explain multiple waves. And lastly, vaccine can avoid unpredictable growth of disease, even if vaccine is not completely efficient and if only a certain proportion of the population chooses to get vaccinated. Future work on this project, I would be investigating the simultaneous double fear model that I showed you. Next, in addition to imitative and observational learning, another mechanism of fear acquisition is information transmission. An interesting model extension arises where we can include behavioral changes due to information and misinformation. And this can give us insights about how, when people are unaware of the actual information, they form their risk perceptions based on the information that is available to them. And this can lead to interesting dynamics. There's another fear loss mechanism, habituation, where people lose fear when they become accustomed to the stimulus and its presence no longer elicits the same level of fear of anxiety. This is currently the situation with COVID, that it has been around for long enough that even if new cases keep on coming, people are going on with their lives as usual, maybe protecting them to some extent by wearing masks, etc. This mechanism comes into play at timescales longer than we consider here in our analysis. So it would be interesting to extend the model to investigate this further. And of course, and lastly, there's another interesting extension of this model, which is to let fearless susceptibles to get vaccinated. So in this model, we were just letting the people who are fearful of the disease to get vaccinated, but the regular susceptibles who are not fearful of vaccine can also get vaccinated, maybe in the presence of policies. For this would require to mindfully choose the rate of vaccination for regular susceptibles in comparison to SFD group, because they may the SFD group may skip queues and may be more proactive in getting vaccinated, basically. Yeah, that's about it. Thanks for listening. Feel free to ask if you have any questions or points of discussion.
Thank you, Avneet. Yeah, that was a fantastic talk. Yeah, thank you so much. Very clear and concise. Yeah, so we would like to give the opportunity for people who want to ask questions. You can put it in the chat if you are not able to speak out loud, or you can raise your hands and I call you. So I can see Rebecca's hand is up. So Rebecca, kindly go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Avneet. Thank you for giving the talk.
Thanks.
You might have explained this, and I might have just missed the explanation. I was curious in the epidemics where you had two waves. The second wave was larger than the first, and in all the work I've done, it's been the other way around. Do you have any? Can you explain why that happens?
So since there is fear of disease in individuals, people isolate, so there are lesser susceptibles available in the first wave. And so disease increases, but the peak is lower for the first wave. Now, as there are insufficient susceptibles, disease starts to decrease, people leave their prophylaxis, and they go back to regular susceptibles. And so when the second wave starts, there are comparatively more susceptibles available to carry on the disease, and which possibly results in a higher second wave.
So essentially the fear of disease compartment is very effective at protecting susceptibles from disease. Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Sonas. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I have question for a slide A7 or 8, I don't remember. Thank you. If you go to that slide. Yeah, here. For mechanism for fair acquisition, you have imitation and observation. Why don't you have these two, and mostly imitation, for fair decay? And for the fair decay, you divide it very separately. I mean, why don't you have these two again in the fair part? The observation can be somehow in the category of a stimulus that you said, but for imitation, we do not have this situation in the, I mean, backward part, you know, for the case of fair decay.
Yeah, that's a good question. This second mechanism can be kind of considered imitation. No, sorry. So imitation in here would mean that you see someone who is not fearful and you imitate their behavior. I'm a major in mathematics, so I don't have deep knowledge of psychology part, but from what I've read from the literature review, it turns out that fear can be learned through imitation. Fear loss, I haven't read anywhere that can happen through imitation. And even if it can happen, it's probably a very small proportion and not worth taking into account.
Yeah, thank you. But anyhow, you know, we can still consider it as we can say, okay, people duplicate each other for the fair situation, but why not for the being careless about the disease, you know?
Yeah.
Why not for disregarding the disease aspects?
So the point with these is like there are many other possibilities. Like even when we were forming, making these extensions to the model, we had two more forms of an extended model, which were more complicated than the one I showed to you. So the thing is, in modeling, we have to choose a parsimonious model, right? Something that can explain what's happening, but it's not too complicated to analyze. So this is the one which does perfectly well.
Yeah, and may I ask another question? For I think it is the next slide for a fair decay categorization. You have four of them. It is two, probably one more slide. Sorry. Oh yeah, thank you. You have actually two category of fair decay, and I think in the first one, the observation for increasing the decay fair can be equivalent somehow with these four that you have again here. You go to details for the fair decay, but for fair increasing, just keeping the situation of observation and imitating. And again, for the rates, we have beta fear of disease and beta fear of vaccination. But in the could you please bring the whole diagram? The whole flow chart. Yeah, thank you. You have beta fear of disease, beta fear of vaccination, and these two betas are separated. But for fear decay, the gamma and alpha is the same.
Mhm.
Do
Yeah,
you
so-
mean for increasing the fear, they can be separated, but for decreasing the fear, they have the same pattern. So the alpha is the same, alpha F, gamma F, but we have beta fear of disease, beta fear of vaccine. They are separated. And
Yeah.
thank you.
That's a good point. So I had these confusions when I was reading this model again. It comes to how many parameters do you want to include? So we wanted to keep it as minimalist as possible because this is an imaginary model with imaginary parameters. So we just fixed the values of disease-related parameters, so beta and gamma. The rest of the fear parameters, so beta FT, beta FE, gamma F alpha, all of them were taken with respect to beta and gamma. So, so we are just overall trying to understand the behavior of the system. You can say we are looking at it from a macro level. We are not trying to figure out each of the parameters at a micro scale.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I also have a question, even as people think about it. So my question is, so looking at the two aspects that you considered in the model, I mean the fear of disease and the fear of vaccine, which one of the aspects had the greatest impact on the final epidemic size, like the final outbreak? Which one had the biggest impact? And like, why was that expected? Like, were you expecting that to happen? And why is that happening?
So I guess if we see the effect on final sites with respect to P, it's SFD that's contributing more to the change, because essentially that P was the scaling down factor when someone is fearful of disease. And so I think we were capturing the fear of disease, the effect of fear of disease more on the final size compared to the fear of vaccine.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. And like, they did really affected the final size. Like, was the impact that great? So like, what I'm trying to mean is, okay, if you ignore the fear of disease and have just a general simple epidemic model, like you started with the SIR model, and then you find the final size, and then compare that to incorporating the fear of the disease into the model and then calculate the final size. What is the difference? Like, how does incorporating this aspect of human behavior into the model affect the final size of the disease?
So between SIR model and the first model, where we just
Yeah, kind of, yeah, like the modified model. Yeah. Sure.
So the file size would definitely drop as we go from SIR to the FAIR model. And that's because with fear coming in, people are isolating, and their isolations are protecting them from the disease. And so if you remember, for some values of P, some population was getting stuck in the SFT compartment. And so that's where we are ending up with lesser people getting infected, and some proportion of the people remaining uninfected, remaining in the SFT or S group. So whereas in SIR model, there were no behavior mechanisms. So there was just simple flow. The susceptible group can only get infected as they come in contact with the infectious people, and then they recover. So the final size is expected to be more in the SIR model compared to the FAIR models.
Right, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, please, do we have any other person asking a question? Okay, I think people are good for now. So, okay, thank you, Avneet, for the talk. That was a fantastic talk. I personally enjoyed it. I love the topic. And so I believe people also enjoyed this talk. Okay, so thank you, and thank everybody for joining us today, and hope to see you again in the subsequent seminars we are yet to have. Okay, see you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Yeah, bye-bye.